What if I told you that deep in the heart of West Africa, a country once ignored by the world's powers was not just surviving? No, it was fighting back, with strength so raw, so fierce, that it's shaking the very foundation of the Sahel region and rewriting its place in history. Burkina Faso, a land carved by the harsh Sahel desert, where hope seemed as dry as the land, and the struggle to survive was as old as the sun rising over the horizon. For years, the world turned a blind eye to the pain of its people. Until now, the story we're about to tell is one of defiance, courage, and blood-soaked soil. A nation that had long been neglected by global powers, now drawing a line in the sand. But this is no ordinary story. This isn't some simple rebellion or some news headline buried under the weight of global silence. No, this is a bold statement, a battle that is shifting the balance of power in Africa. And it all came to a head on a hot June day. In one of the most shocking military offensives in modern African history, Burkina Faso unleashed a wave of strikes so precise, so overwhelming, that it obliterated terrorist strongholds across the Sahel in one fell swoop. The message was loud and clear. Burkina Faso wasn't just defending itself anymore. It was fighting back, and it was winning. On that day, an enemy that had terrorized the region for years found itself caught off guard. Leaders of these insurgent groups, who thought they had long established their reign of fear, watched in disbelief as their fortified hideouts were reduced to nothing. One by one, their strongholds crumbled as the Burkinabe military, backed by the people of the land, took matters into their own hands. They didn't just retaliate. They fought with such precision and intensity that their enemies didn't know where to run, or even if they could escape. From the dense forests of the east to the dry plains in the west, the skies were filled with the roar of jets, drones, and helicopters. This was the moment the world had been waiting for. Burkina Faso had stepped into the spotlight. But what made this victory so extraordinary was not just the military might. It was the heart of the country, the spirit of its people. And yet, as the smoke from the explosions began to clear, the world was left with one question. What would happen next? For now, the skies above Burkina Faso were calm, but the storm was far from over. The enemy had been crippled, yes, but not defeated. And as the dust settled on this victory, something darker loomed on the horizon. The battle was not just for land. It was for Africa's soul. It was a battle for freedom, for justice, for sovereignty. And the world was watching. But would Burkina Faso's newfound power be enough to keep the flames of revolution alive? It was only a few months ago that the winds of change began to stir in Burkina Faso. People had grown weary of waiting for help from the outside world, watching as foreign powers interfered in African matters too often for their own gain. The leaders of Burkina Faso understood this better than anyone. They had been forced to learn the hard way that no one was coming to their aid. The West had its eyes elsewhere, and the surrounding African nations were struggling with their own battles. It was during one of the darkest hours that a leader rose from the ashes, someone who understood the depth of his people's pain, the strength that lay in their unity, and the fire that burned in their hearts. His name was Captain Yakuba Sambi, a man whose rise from soldier to commander mirrored the rise of his nation, a nation now determined to fight for its freedom by its own hands, without asking for permission. Sambi had spent years in the military, watching as his country's resources were depleted, its people suffering under the weight of terrorism, poverty, and corruption. But he knew the heart of his people. He knew they had more than just hope. They had a fierce will to survive. And that would be their greatest weapon. In the beginning, the people were reluctant. They'd seen too many promises broken by politicians and foreign governments. Their hopes had been dashed again and again. But Sambi wasn't a man of promises. He was a man of action. And it didn't take long before the people realized that he was not just another leader, not just another face to be ignored by the world. He was a man of the people, who spoke their language, fought their fight, and understood their pain. It wasn't long before the army of Burkina Faso was not just an army. It was a movement. Ordinary citizens, farmers, teachers, and merchants all began to take up arms alongside the military. Volunteers from every corner of the country swelled the ranks. They weren't soldiers by profession, but they were defenders of their homes, their families, and their land. They called themselves the Volontaires de la Défense Locale, local defense volunteers, standing side by side with the regular army, united under the same flag and under one goal: to drive the terrorists from their land. But this was not going to be an easy fight. Sambi knew that. He knew that they were up against a brutal, well-organized enemy, one that would stop at nothing to maintain control. Terrorists who had been entrenched in the region for years, who had turned the Sahel into a nightmare for innocent civilians. But what the terrorists didn't understand was that Burkina Faso was not like the other countries they had conquered. This was not a land that would fall quietly into the dust. As the first assault began, the military and local volunteers launched coordinated attacks across the eastern and western borders. Drones soared through the air, tracking the enemy's movements with unrelenting precision. Ground units advanced, cutting through thick forests and desolate landscapes, each strike more forceful than the last. The terrorists were caught completely off guard. They didn't expect the Burkinabe to hit them first, let alone hit them with such fury. One of the most stunning moments came in the small town of Wabia, where a heavily armed terrorist group tried to overrun a Burkinabe military unit. The fight was short, violent, and decisive. By the time the dust cleared, the terrorists had fled in disgrace, leaving behind the bodies of their fallen comrades and a pile of weapons. It was a victory, but it was only the beginning. The days that followed were marked by even more relentless offensives, as the Burkinabe military, alongside the local defense volunteers, pushed deeper into enemy territory. There was no retreat. Every terrorist stronghold, every weapons cache, every hideout was targeted with precision. By the time the sun set on each day, the Burkinabe had gained ground, and the enemy had lost yet another base. In the midst of all this, the Burkinabe people held their breath. Would this military offensive be enough to turn the tide? Would the world take notice? And perhaps most importantly, would they have the strength to continue when the enemy regrouped and struck back? As the battle raged on, one thing was clear: Burkina Faso was no longer just a small, forgotten country. It was becoming a symbol of Africa's defiance, of the continent's unyielding desire to take control of its own destiny. And as the people of Burkina Faso continued to fight, one question loomed larger than all others. Could the revolution survive, or would it crumble under the weight of betrayal and outside interference? And then, one fateful day, just as the tide of battle seemed to shift in Burkina Faso's favor, the world was forced to reckon with the unstoppable force that had risen in the Sahel. A force led by Captain Yakuba Sambi, whose determination had turned a nation of victims into a nation of warriors. But as victory seemed within reach, something darker awaited. The real war, one for the soul of Africa, was just beginning. The world had underestimated Burkina Faso for far too long. They had seen it as a forgotten corner of the African continent, one where the shadows of chaos seemed to swallow up any hope of progress. But what the world didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that the heart of Burkina Faso was pounding with a new, untamable force. In the days following the initial offensive, the victories piled up, one after another. The terrorists who had plagued the country for so long found themselves not only under attack, but overwhelmed by the sheer will and unity of the Burkinabe people. Their strongholds, once thought to be impregnable, were crumbling under the weight of relentless Burkinabe airstrikes and ground operations. On May 22nd, in the small town of Wabia, a heavily armed group of insurgents tried to ambush a Burkinabe military unit. What followed was a brutal confrontation. But instead of retreating or surrendering, the soldiers fought with an unyielding spirit, pushing back the attackers with calculated precision. When the dust settled, the enemy had scattered, leaving behind the bodies of their fallen comrades and an arsenal of weapons that would never reach their intended targets. The message was clear: Burkina Faso was no longer simply defending itself. It was taking the fight to the enemy, and it would not stop until it had reclaimed every inch of its land. The victories were sweet, but the battle was far from over. As the Burkinabe forces advanced, the terrorists, though suffering heavy losses, continued to regroup and launch counterattacks. But they were no longer prepared for what awaited them. In the dense forests of Musakwi, elite reconnaissance units had begun to track and neutralize the enemy with ruthless precision. As the soldiers moved deeper into the heart of terrorist territory, they seized weapons, supplies, and intelligence, enough to deal a devastating blow to the insurgents' operations. The enemy was stunned. They had not expected this kind of response. They had assumed that the Burkinabe military would simply wait for their next move, but they had underestimated the resolve of a nation that had been pushed to the edge. The military strategy was not one of mere survival. It was one of complete disruption. The Burkinabe forces, working in coordination with local volunteers and military advisors, operated like a finely tuned machine. Every strike was calculated, every move deliberate. It was as if the entire country had become a battlefield, with every citizen, every soldier, and every volunteer playing their part in the larger mission. But even as the enemy's grip weakened, the Burkinabe knew they couldn't afford to relax. Every victory came with its own cost, and the scars of war were becoming visible on the faces of the people. Yet through the hardships, a new sense of unity had emerged. People who had once lived in fear, unsure of what tomorrow might bring, now stood together as one, defying their enemies and their fears. They had come to understand that their struggle was not just for their own survival, but for the survival of their nation's soul. As June rolled in, the offensive intensified. Units engaged enemy forces in Wallobia, Musakwi, and Sintaso. They fought for every inch of ground, striking with a force that sent ripples of shock throughout the region. In each location, the enemy's plans were shattered. Terrorists who thought they could regroup and plan their next attack were met with devastating airstrikes that left nothing but rubble in their wake. But even as the Burkinabe forces pressed on, the enemy, though battered, refused to give up. They had been dealt heavy blows, but they still had the means to fight back. Their forces regrouped, preparing for one last stand in the forests of Palma. They had gathered in force, hoping to strike a decisive blow against the Burkinabe defenders. But Sambi and his commanders were one step ahead. They had been watching, waiting, and planning. They knew exactly where the enemy was hiding, and they knew the time had come to end this once and for all. On June 3rd, a series of coordinated strikes took place. From the sky, drones and attack jets swept through the air, locking onto enemy positions. Ground troops, moving with military precision, surrounded the forests of Palma. And then, as the terrorists were gathering for what they believed would be a final offensive, the Burkinabe military delivered a devastating blow. A hidden weapons cache deep in the forest exploded in a fiery blaze. The enemy, caught completely off guard, found themselves surrounded. Those who attempted to flee were hunted down and eliminated with ruthless efficiency. The result was a near-total decimation of the terrorist forces in the region. And it was a victory that shook the Sahel to its core. Burkina Faso had not only defended its soil, but it had also sent a powerful message to the entire continent and to the world that Africa was no longer a passive player in its own destiny. This was no longer a region that could be ignored. This was a new Africa, one that was willing to fight for its own future with its own hands. But just as the Burkinabe forces began to celebrate their hard-earned victories, they received word of an impending threat. A new wave of terrorists, led by an experienced commander, was already on the move. And this time, they weren't coming from the south. They were coming from the north, through the vast desert. The Burkinabe knew this would be their biggest challenge yet. The stage was set for a battle that would determine the future of the country and, perhaps, the future of the entire Sahel region. Captain Sambi stood on the edge of a cliff, staring out over the vast desert landscape. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. His country had already come so far, but the road ahead would be even harder. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the sand, he knew the next battle would be unlike any they had faced before. His voice, steady and determined, echoed through the air. "We've won battles, but the war is far from over. The enemy will come again, but we will be ready. We will fight for our land, for our people, and for the future of Africa. This is not just our fight. This is the fight of every nation that has been told it's too small, too weak, too powerless to stand up for itself. And so, with that declaration, the stage was set for the final confrontation. Burkina Faso, with its unbreakable spirit, would face the storm head-on. But the question remained, could they defeat this new threat? Could they hold the line against an enemy that had learned from their past mistakes? The sun rose on Burkina Faso like it had for countless generations, rising over a land that had seen its fair share of darkness but never lost its light. Yet this day felt different. The winds of change were in the air, and the Burkinabe people could feel it in their bones. They had stood tall in the face of unimaginable adversity, and now the fight was on the precipice of something bigger, something that could change the course of Africa forever. As the Burkinabe military prepared for what was about to come, the people of Burkina Faso felt an energy that had not been present in years, a fierce optimism born from unity, sacrifice, and the promise of victory. But with that optimism came the harsh reality of the situation. The enemy had been battered, but they were not broken. The terrorists who had once terrorized the Sahel were regrouping under new leadership, an experienced, ruthless commander who had learned from his predecessor's mistakes. Sambi had seen the reports. He knew that this new wave of insurgents was different. They weren't just a scattered group of rebels anymore. They were organized, determined, and well-equipped. The intelligence was clear. The enemy was coming from the north, using the vast, unforgiving desert as their shield. They had a new strategy, a strategy that aimed to strike deep into the heart of Burkina Faso. But Sambi wasn't the kind of man to be intimidated. He had lived through betrayal, through internal struggles, and through the weight of foreign interference. He had seen firsthand how the world had turned a blind eye to his people's suffering, and now he was determined to make sure the world couldn't ignore Burkina Faso any longer. The Burkinabe military had fought bravely, but this next phase would require something even more than just firepower. It would require strategy, unity, and resilience. Sambi knew that, as always, the heart of the fight lay not just in the soldiers, but in the people of the land, the farmers, the teachers, the shopkeepers, and the volunteers. They were the lifeblood of the revolution, and their resolve would be tested like never before. As the enemy moved closer, the Burkinabe forces went to work, preparing for the most crucial battle yet. Every base, every village, and every town along the northern border was fortified. The local defense volunteers were given the tools they needed to defend their homes. In the military camps, soldiers and volunteers alike practiced the same strategy. Fight with precision, strike with speed, and never give the enemy a chance to breathe. On June 15th, the first signs of the enemy's advance appeared. It was like a wave, a slow, creeping storm that seemed to come from nowhere. The vast, barren expanse of the desert hid them well, but the Burkinabe military had been preparing for this moment. For days, air reconnaissance drones had been scouring the skies, gathering intelligence on the enemy's movements. And when the time came, the Burkinabe forces struck fast. The air was filled with the roar of attack jets, and soon the sky became a battlefield. The enemy, hidden in their desert bunkers, thought they were safe, but they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated the Burkinabe. As the sun dipped low in the sky, the first wave of the offensive began. The Burkinabe military launched an airstrike so precise it was almost surgical. Their missiles tore through the desert, obliterating enemy bases before the insurgents even knew what hit them. The ground forces, working in tandem with the aerial support, pushed forward with a calculated ferocity. No stone was left unturned, no position left unchallenged. At the heart of the northern desert, a massive terrorist stronghold, one that had been the enemy's base of operations for months, was targeted. As the Burkinabe forces launched their final, decisive assault, the explosion that followed was so powerful that it could be heard for miles. The entire base was wiped from the map, reducing it to nothing but ash and rubble. The terrorists, stunned and disoriented, had no chance to regroup. It was a blow so devastating that it shattered the enemy's morale. But the Burkinabe forces knew that this was not the end of the fight. They had dealt a significant blow, but the war was still ongoing. The terrorists, though wounded, would regroup. They always did. In the aftermath of the attack, Sambi gathered his commanders and the local defense leaders in a small camp outside the desert's reach. The night was quiet, but the air was thick with anticipation. They had won a major victory, but the enemy had learned from their previous mistakes. The commander knew that it would take more than just firepower to bring an end to this conflict. It would take unity, loyalty, and a relentless belief in the cause. "We've done well," Sambi began, his voice steady and strong. "But the fight isn't over. They will return, and we will be ready. We fight not just for Burkina Faso, but for every African nation that has been told it cannot stand on its own." The men and women in the room nodded, their faces grim but resolute. They understood the stakes. Sambi's words were more than just motivational. They were a call to arms, a rallying cry for a nation that would no longer bend to the whims of foreign powers or be crushed under the boot of terror. As the Burkinabe forces gathered their strength for the next phase, the enemy began to move again, regrouping in the mountains to the north. The fight was about to enter its most dangerous phase yet, one where every move, every decision, and every soldier's resolve would be tested to the limit. But the people of Burkina Faso had already shown the world something that could never be taken away. A nation that, once dismissed as weak and forgotten, had risen to reclaim its destiny. They had not only fought for their land, they had fought for the very spirit of Africa itself. And now, as the Burkinabe forces prepared for the next wave, one truth remained clear: the world would be watching. Because what was happening in Burkina Faso wasn't just a military campaign, it was a revolution. And no one, not the terrorists, not the foreign powers, and not even the doubters, could stop the flames that had been ignited in the heart of Africa. The storm that had been brewing for years was now at its peak, and no one could predict what would happen when it finally broke. But one thing was certain: Burkina Faso's fight for freedom, sovereignty, and justice was far from over. This was only the beginning.